It all started when I was 16 back in the small, dusty town I grew up in. It was the summer before my junior year of high school, and boredom hung heavy in the air. I used to spend hours scrolling through forums, Reddit threads, and obscure corners of the internet looking for something, anything, to pass the time. That's how I stumbled upon the thread. The Most Disturbing Creepypasta Horror Stories, it was called. I thought it'd be fun, you know? A thrill. A distraction from the monotony. The post listed dozens of stories, each more twisted than the last, but one caught my attention. The title was simple, The Hollow One. It wasn't just the title that grabbed me, though. It was the warning underneath, do not read this story aloud. Of course, that only made me more curious. The story itself wasn't even that long, just a few paragraphs. It told of a shadowy figure with a featureless face, a humanoid void that appeared at the edge of your vision if you dared to summon it. The instructions were clear. Read the incantation at the end of the story aloud, and you'd invite the Hollow One into your life. The whole thing was cheesy, like something ripped straight from a bad horror movie. I laughed it off and read it aloud, the incantation tumbling from my lips before I even realized what I was doing. Nothing happened. For days, I forgot about it entirely. But then, things started changing. It began small, little things I could explain away. A faint tapping noise on my bedroom window at night, even though my window was on the second floor. Shadows darting in the corner of my vision, always gone when I turned to look. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise that froze the blood in my veins. A slow, deliberate scraping like fingernails dragging along the wooden floor. I sat up, straining to hear over the pounding of my heartbeat. The room was dark, but not dark enough to hide the faint outline of something crouched in the corner. It was tall. Too tall, even while crouching. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisted in ways that defied anatomy. But the worst part was its face, or lack thereof. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless surface, like someone had erased it from existence. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The figure didn't move either. It just sat there, watching. Or at least, I think it was watching. How could I tell without eyes? Hours passed. Or maybe just seconds. I must have passed out from fear because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sunlight poured into my room, chasing away the shadows. I told myself it was a nightmare. It had to be. But when I looked at the floor where the figure had been, there were scratches, long, deep gouges carved into the wood. I wanted to believe it was a prank, maybe by my little brother, but the fear in his eyes when I confronted him told me otherwise. That was just the beginning. The Hollow One began to haunt me in the daylight, too. It didn't care about darkness or light. I'd see it at the edge of the football field during practice, its blank face tilting unnaturally as it stared. It followed me home from school, its elongated shadow stretching behind me on the sidewalk. No one else could see it. I tried telling my parents, but they chalked it up to stress. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped going out. None of it mattered. The Hollow One didn't need an invitation anymore. Then the dreams started. Every night, I'd find myself in a long, empty hallway, dimly lit and endless. The air was heavy, suffocating, and each step I took echoed like a gunshot. I knew it was behind me. I could feel it. But no matter how fast I ran, I could never escape the sound of those slow, scraping footsteps following me. One night, I made the mistake of looking back. It was closer than ever, its featureless face inches from mine. Its mouth, God, it had a mouth, stretched open, wider than any human mouth could, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A scream tore from my throat as it lunged forward, swallowing me whole. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. But the nightmare didn't end when I opened my eyes. It was there, standing at the foot of my bed, its blank face mere inches from mine. I don't know how long it stood there before it spoke, if you can even call it that. Its voice wasn't a voice at all, but a hollow whisper that echoed inside my skull. You invited me. I didn't know what to do. I begged, screamed, pleaded for it to leave me alone, but it only laughed. A hollow, empty sound that sent shivers down my spine. That's when I realized it wouldn't stop. It couldn't. I tried everything to break the curse. I burned sage, hung crosses, even visited a psychic who charged me $200 to perform some kind of cleansing ritual. Nothing worked. I started researching, desperate for answers. That's when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. The Hollow One wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't its first victim. There were dozens of accounts scattered across forums and obscure websites, all eerily similar to mine. Each victim had read the incantation aloud. Each one had been haunted by the figure. And each account ended the same way, with the victim disappearing without a trace. No one ever escaped it. Now, I'm telling you this because I'm running out of time. I can feel it watching me even as I write this. Its presence is heavier than ever, suffocating and cold. I don't know how much longer I have before it takes me too. I'm leaving this as a warning. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you. If you ever come across the hollow one, do not, under any circumstances, read it aloud. I can hear it now, the slow scraping of its claws against the floor. It's closer than ever. I can feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and empty. This is the end for me. But maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to be for you.
Story number 2.
I never wanted to move back to my hometown. It was a last resort after my divorce, cheap rent, a quiet place to get my life together. The house I found was old, creaky, and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was cheap, and I figured I could live with the quirks. The neighbors, though, they were weird. I first noticed it when I was unpacking my boxes. I'd catch glimpses of them standing in their windows, staring at my house. If I waved, they didn't wave back. If I tried to approach them in the yard, they'd retreat inside without a word. I chalked it up to small-town eccentricities. After all, I hadn't been back in years, and people around here were always different. Things started getting strange about a week after I moved in. It was a Tuesday night, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old windows, but then it grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. It was coming from the front door. I froze. My first instinct was to check the peephole, but something about the sound, too measured, too insistent, made me hesitate. Instead, I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. The tapping stopped for a moment, only to start again, faster this time. My heart raced as I grabbed a kitchen knife and edged closer to the door. When I finally looked through the peephole, no one was there. I opened the door. Nothing. The porch was empty, the street silent. The next morning, I found scratches on the door, long and jagged, like claw marks. The tapping became a nightly occurrence. Always the same, slow, deliberate, growing faster until I couldn't take it anymore and flung the door open, only to find nothing. The neighbors started acting even stranger. They stopped staring and started avoiding me altogether. If I stepped outside, they'd scurry into their homes. If I drove past them, they'd turn away, pretending not to see me. I tried asking the man next door about the noises, but he just shook his head and muttered, "It's best if you don't talk about it." Then he slammed his door in my face. The worst night came about 2 weeks after I moved in. The tapping started around midnight, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was at the windows. Every window in the house all at once. The sound was deafening, as if dozens of hands were pounding against the glass. I ran from room to room, yanking the curtains shut, but the tapping followed me, growing louder, more frantic. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't random. It was coordinated, like whatever was outside was hunting me. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the knife, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, but I didn't know where to go. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the backyard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. At first, I thought it was a person, a man maybe, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized how wrong I was. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its head was tilted at an angle that no human neck could achieve, and its eyes, God, its eyes, they glowed, a sickly yellow light that pierced through the darkness and locked onto me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I screamed and stumbled back, slamming the sliding glass door shut and locking it. The creature didn't stop. It pressed its face against the glass, its breath fogging up the pain. That's when I realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, furry, dozens of them, all with the same unnatural proportions and glowing yellow eyes. They surrounded the house, pressing their twisted faces against the windows, tapping in unison. I don't remember much after that. I think I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The figures were gone, but the house was in ruins. Every window was shattered, the furniture overturned, deep gouges carved into the walls and floors. I packed my bags and left that day, abandoning the lease, the deposit, everything. I didn't care. I drove until the town was nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever haunted that house was bound to it. But last night, in the motel room where I'm staying, I heard it again. The tapping. Slow, deliberate, coming from the window. And I think I know now why the neighbors wouldn't talk to me.
Story number 3.
I should have never taken that job. It seemed like a dream gig at first, an easy paycheck for a couple of months. I was hired to catalog and clean out an old estate in the middle of nowhere, a house that had sat abandoned for decades. The owner, some distant relative of the family who'd lived there, wanted it prepped for sale. The house was enormous, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It sat at the end of a long, winding driveway surrounded by dense woods. When I first arrived, it felt like the house was watching me, its empty windows like black, unblinking eyes. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. The furniture was still there, covered in moth-eaten sheets, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in long strips. Everything about the place felt wrong. Too quiet, too cold. But the money was good, and I figured I'd just power through. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time inventorying the belongings, antique furniture, yellowed books, faded photographs. It was tedious work, but nothing unusual. Then I found the diary. It was hidden in the bottom drawer of an old writing desk, bound in cracked leather. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out most of the writing. It belonged to a girl named Eleanor, the youngest daughter of the family who'd lived there. The entries were dated from the 1920s, and at first they were innocent enough. Musings about her siblings, her lessons, her favorite books. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Eleanor began writing about a visitor she'd seen in the woods. She described it as a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that watched her from the tree line. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the entries grew more frantic as the figure got closer. By the final entries, Eleanor was pleading for help. She wrote that the figure had started appearing inside the house, standing at the foot of her bed, whispering her name in the dead of night. The diary ended abruptly, with a single scrawled sentence, "It's in the attic." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. The attic. I hadn't been up there yet, and I wasn't planning to. The door was nailed shut, and I figured whatever was up there could stay there. That night, I stayed in the house. The owner had offered to put me up in a motel, but I wanted to save money. Big mistake. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking back and forth above me. My room was directly under the attic. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then the footsteps stopped, and something heavy thudded against the floor. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Another thud. Then another, like something was being dragged across the attic floor. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my keys and get the hell out of there, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The dragging stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and raspy, coming from directly above me. It was faint, but I could make out the words, "Come see." I don't know how long I stayed like that, clutching the blanket and staring at the ceiling. Eventually the whispers stopped, and the house fell silent again. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day I decided to leave. Screw the job. Screw the paycheck. I wasn't staying another night in that house. As I packed my things, I noticed something strange. The attic door, which had been nailed shut, was ajar. The nails were lying on the floor, bent and twisted, as if they'd been pried out from the inside. I should have left right then and there, but something compelled me to look. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single grimy window. The air was thick and suffocating, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. In the center of the attic was an old trunk, its lid slightly open. I hesitated, every fiber of my being telling me to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. I knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside was a doll, dressed in a tattered white gown. Its face was porcelain, but the paint was cracked and peeling, giving it an eerie, lifelike quality. Its eyes were open, staring directly at me, and its mouth was slightly agape, as if it was about to speak. Then it did. "Stay," it whispered. I don't remember running down the stairs or getting into my car. All I remember is driving as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? I just told the owner I couldn't finish the job and left it at that. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the news when I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Fire destroys historic estate. The article said the house had burned to the ground. The cause unknown. No one was hurt. No one had been inside. But the final line of the article stuck with me. Firefighters report hearing strange noises from the attic before the roof collapsed. I don't know what was in that house, but I'm certain it's still out there, waiting, and I'll never, ever go back.
Story number 4.
The job seemed easy enough. Security guard for the night shift at an old hospital that had been closed for decades. The building was slated for demolition, and the city needed someone to ensure no vandals or squatters broke in during the final weeks. The pay was decent, and I figured I'd just binge-watch shows on my laptop and clock out at sunrise. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped inside. The air was cold, not the kind of cold you feel from the weather, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that felt unnatural. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows in the hallways. My workstation was set up in the main lobby, near a bank of dusty wheelchairs and a nurse's station that hadn't been used in decades. I'd been given a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and a map of the building. The instructions were simple. Do a walk-through every hour, check the cameras, and call the police if anyone was trespassing. The first few hours were uneventful. I made my rounds, sweeping my flashlight through empty corridors and patient rooms that reeked of mildew. Most of the equipment had been cleared out, but a few abandoned gurneys and IV stands remained, their shadows twisting in the dim light. Around 2 a.m., things started getting strange. I was watching the security monitors when I noticed something on the camera feed for the 3rd floor. Movement. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the screen. I leaned in closer, thinking it might be a rat or some other pest. But then I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still at the end of the hallway. It was a woman wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Her back was to the camera, and her hair was long, matted, and hung like a curtain. I grabbed the walkie-talkie, my voice shaking as I radioed for backup. But the static was deafening, drowning out my words. I told myself it was probably a homeless person, someone who'd slipped in unnoticed. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the 3rd floor. The elevator was out of service, so I took the stairs, the metal steps groaning under my weight. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, the air was colder, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. I swept my flashlight down the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. The corridor was empty. No woman, no movement, just rows of dark, empty rooms. I checked every door, my footsteps echoing in the silence, but there was no sign of anyone. I was about to head back downstairs when I heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing. It was coming from room 306. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't ignore it. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking like a scream. The room was empty, except for an old hospital bed pushed against the wall. The sobbing stopped the moment I stepped inside, and then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back still to me, her gown dirty and torn. Her head twitched slightly, like she was listening. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't respond. Slowly she began to turn, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on strings. When I saw her face, I staggered back. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, her skin pale and stretched tight over her skull. Her mouth was too wide, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. She let out a low, guttural laugh that reverberated in my chest. I bolted. I didn't care about protocol or my job. I just ran. As I sprinted down the hallway, the lights flickered violently, and the air filled with the sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps, like a stampede chasing me. I reached the stairwell and practically threw myself down the steps, my flashlight clattering to the floor. When I burst into the lobby, I was met with silence. But it wasn't over. As I grabbed my keys and turned to leave, the main doors slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty building. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lights in the lobby flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. That's when I heard the whispers. They came from every direction, soft and insidious, growing louder until they became a deafening roar. I covered my ears, screaming for it to stop, but the whispers were inside my head, clawing at my sanity. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces distorted and wrong, their bodies twitching and writhing as they moved toward me. The woman from the third floor was among them, her empty eyes locked onto mine. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, parked at the edge of the hospital grounds. My hands were trembling, my heart racing, but I was alive. I quit that night. I didn't even bother to collect my last paycheck. The hospital was demolished a week later, but sometimes, when I drive past the empty lot where it once stood, I swear I can still hear the whispers, and I'll never forget her face.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends, Mike and Jenna, had found an old cabin deep in the Appalachian woods on some vacation rental site. Rustic charm, they called it. Perfect for disconnecting. The drive up was long and winding, the kind of road where your cell signal fades to nothing and the trees press close, hemming you in. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in shadow. The cabin itself was eerie. Its wooden frame was weathered and splintered, and the windows seemed too dark, like they were swallowing the light. Mike joked that it looked like the set of a horror movie, and Jenna laughed, but I didn't. Something about the place made my stomach churn. Inside, it wasn't much better. The air was stale, the furniture ancient and mismatched, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of people with blank expressions. Jenna found a dusty, handmade dream catcher nailed above the fireplace. "Cute," she said, but I hated it immediately. The feathers were grimy, the beads cracked, and the whole thing gave off a feeling of dread. We settled in, made dinner, and tried to shake off the unease. By the time night fell, the cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from a single weak bulb in the kitchen. We decided to go to bed early. That's when the knocking started. At first it was faint, just a single tap on the cabin wall. We thought it was an animal, maybe a branch swaying in the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate, a knock, 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 as if someone was at the door. Mike, trying to play the tough guy, grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door. There was nothing out there, just the darkness of the woods stretching endlessly in every direction. He shrugged it off, but the knocking didn't stop. It moved, from the front door to the side of the cabin, then to the back. It circled us, always staying just out of sight. Jenna was scared now, her voice shaking as she begged us to leave. Mike tried to calm her down, saying it was probably just the wood creaking or some local wildlife, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. Around midnight, the knocking finally stopped. The silence was worse. We sat in the living room, too afraid to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. And then we heard it. A whisper, soft and guttural, coming from the fireplace. It sounded like a voice, but the words were garbled, like they didn't belong to any language I'd ever heard. Jenna screamed and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Mike shone the flashlight toward the fireplace, but the beam flickered and died. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, pressing in on us from all sides. Suddenly, the fireless hearth erupted with movement. Something crawled out, long, spindly limbs that bent in unnatural ways, claws scraping against the brick. Its head was wrong, too big for its body, with empty sockets where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was full of teeth, too many teeth, jagged and yellow, all twisting into a grotesque grin. It moved fast, scuttling across the ceiling like a spider. We bolted, screaming, slamming the door behind us as we ran into the woods. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, the cabin a speck in the distance. As we sped down the narrow dirt road, Jenna started crying, pointing at the rearview mirror. "It's following us," she whispered. I looked back and saw it, barely visible at the edge of the trees, keeping pace with the car. Its limbs moved in jerks like a broken puppet, and its grin never wavered. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, bursting into the only open diner, breathless and wild-eyed. The waitress, an older woman, took one look at us and shook her head. "You came from the woods, didn't you?" she asked. We nodded, too scared to speak. She leaned in close, her voice low. "You should never go back. That cabin? It's not meant for people, and whatever you saw, it doesn't forget." We left the next morning, driving straight home without stopping. None of us talked about what happened, not even to each other, but sometimes late at night I hear knocking. Soft at first, then louder. Always 3 knocks, always deliberate. I don't look out the window anymore, because I know it's still there, watching, waiting.
Story number 6.
It all started when we moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. My wife, Sarah, and I had been searching for a place to settle down. The idea of living out in the country, away from the hustle and bustle, seemed like a dream come true. The house was beautiful, if a bit worn down, and it was cheap. Too cheap, we should have known. The first few days were peaceful. The air was fresh, the neighbors were friendly, and the house was big enough for us to start a family. But soon after we unpacked, things began to feel, off. There was an oppressive silence at night, one that settled like a thick fog. It wasn't like the usual quiet of the countryside. No, this was something different. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath. At first, I didn't think much of it. I chalked it up to the newness of the place. But as time went on, things started happening. Small things. A light left on in the hallway when we were certain we'd turned it off. A door that would creak open by itself. The smell of something burning, like wood, that would fill the house on the rare occasions we'd go out and come back. One night, it was especially bad. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed off the wooden floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door. I was terrified, but I told myself it was just the house settling. Still, I couldn't ignore the cold feeling that washed over me as I turned over to Sarah, asleep beside me. I wanted to wake her, but I was too afraid. Instead, I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The door creaked open. I froze. The footsteps entered the room, and I could hear them getting closer, the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I reached out to shake Sarah awake, but my hands stopped midair when I saw it. There, standing at the foot of our bed, was a figure. It was a woman, her face covered by dark, tangled hair. She was dressed in a long, tattered gown, and her skin was pale and sickly, like someone who had been dead for years. Her eyes were the worst part. They were wide, unblinking, and black as night. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The woman tilted her head, slowly, as though studying me. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared through the wall. I lay there in shock for what felt like hours, unable to move or speak. The next morning, I told Sarah what happened. She listened, but she didn't seem convinced. It was probably just a dream, she said, brushing it off with a nervous laugh. But I knew what I saw, and the strange occurrences didn't stop. They only got worse. Over the following days, I began to notice more strange things. Shadows that moved in the corner of my vision. Doors that would slam shut on their own. And sometimes, at night, I would hear a voice. A whisper, low and unintelligible, coming from the walls. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. But one night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement, determined to find the source of whatever was haunting us. The basement was damp and musty, filled with boxes and old furniture. I could barely see in the dim light of my flashlight, but something caught my eye. There, on the far wall, was a large, cracked mirror. I hadn't noticed it before. It looked ancient, covered in dust, and the edges were frayed with age. As I walked closer, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in white clouds, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The mirror, it didn't reflect me. I stared into it, and instead of seeing my own reflection, I saw the woman. Her pale face, twisted in a grotesque smile, was pressed up against the glass. Her eyes were still black, but they were wide with hunger, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes. My flashlight fell to the ground and flickered out. I heard the sound of her breathing behind me, hot and ragged. "Leave. Now," she whispered, the words barely audible but so clear in my mind. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I was back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, but the house felt different. The air was heavier, thicker. I couldn't sleep, not with the sound of something scraping against the walls, scratching, gnawing at the foundation. The next day, I called a local historian to learn about the house's past. I had to know what was happening to us. The historian told me something that made my blood run cold. The farmhouse had once belonged to a woman named Edith Hale, who had lived there alone for years. According to the records, Edith had been a recluse, a widow with no family, and people said she was a bit strange. They said she dabbled in dark rituals, trying to communicate with things beyond the veil. But one night, she disappeared without a trace, and no one ever saw her again. The historian's voice dropped to a whisper. Some people believe she never left, that she's still there, trapped in the walls, waiting for someone to let her out. I didn't need to hear more. I already knew the truth. That night, as I sat in the living room with Sarah, I heard the scratching again, louder this time. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was coming from the floorboards, from the ceiling. And then I heard something else. A voice, a low growl, coming from the shadows. "Let me out." I turned to Sarah, but she was staring at the doorway, her face pale. "Who? Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I knew. The woman, the thing in the mirror, it was coming for us. We left that night without packing a single thing. We didn't even look back. We moved into a hotel, and I never set foot in that farmhouse again. But every once in a while, when the night is too quiet and the shadows stretch too long, I can hear her. The woman in the walls, whispering, waiting. She still wants to be let out, and I fear one day she might get what she wants.
Story number 7.
It was just another ride on my commute home. I take the same train every evening, a slow, clattering subway through the city that eventually crawls out into the suburbs. It's usually half empty at night, quiet enough that I can doze off if I need to. But that night was different. I was running late from work, so I caught the last train of the night. The platform was deserted when I arrived, the air cold and still. As the train pulled in, its headlights cut through the darkness like two ghostly eyes. The doors slid open with a faint hiss, and I stepped inside. The carriage was almost empty. There were only a handful of people, an old man in a faded trench coat reading a newspaper, a couple huddled together in the corner, and a woman sitting alone near the middle of the car. Her face was pale, her hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She was staring straight ahead, not at a phone, not at the window, just at nothing. I chose a seat at the far end, wanting to keep to myself. The train lurched forward, the hum of the engine vibrating through the seats. I settled in, ready to zone out for the long ride. But something felt wrong. The usual sounds of the train, the clatter of wheels on the tracks, the occasional squeal of brakes, were muted, as if muffled by a heavy fog. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the lights in the carriage flickered every few seconds. I glanced at the other passengers. The old man had lowered his newspaper and was staring at the floor, his hands trembling. The couple were whispering to each other, their faces pale and tense. The woman in the middle hadn't moved at all. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the flickering lights. But then I realized the shadows in the carriage were moving, stretching, twisting, growing longer and darker. They crept along the walls and floor like black water, pooling around the feet of the passengers. I looked toward the woman in the middle. The shadows seemed to be drawn to her, wrapping around her ankles and climbing up her legs. She still hadn't moved, her face blank, her eyes staring ahead. But now her lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. The couple stood abruptly, clutching each other. The man shouted, "What the hell is happening?" But his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The old man dropped his newspaper and stumbled toward the door, banging on it with his fists, shouting for the train to stop. And then the lights went out. The carriage was plunged into darkness, and for a moment all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then, faintly, I heard the whispers. They came from every direction, low and guttural, overlapping in a chorus of unintelligible words. When the lights flickered back on, the woman in the middle seat was standing. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her neck bent so far to the side that it looked broken. Her eyes were black, completely black, and her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The shadows surged toward her, swirling around her like a living thing. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The couple screamed and tried to run, but the shadows reached out, pulling them back. They disappeared into the darkness, their cries cut off abruptly. The old man collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest, his face contorted in terror. I was frozen, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman, or whatever she was, turned her head toward me. Her smile widened, and she took a step forward. "Why are you still here?" she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I scrambled to my feet, backing away until I was pressed against the door at the far end of the carriage. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open behind me. Without thinking, I jumped out, landing hard on the gravel beside the tracks. I ran. I didn't know where I was or how far I was from the next station, but I ran as fast as I could. The train sat motionless on the tracks behind me, its lights flickering in the darkness. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, following me as I fled. Eventually, I reached a small maintenance station and found an attendant who called for help. When the authorities arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no one else on the train, that I must have been hallucinating from exhaustion, but I know what I saw. I haven't taken the train since that night. I walk everywhere now, no matter how far or how late. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear the whispers. And when I pass the train yard on my way home, I swear I can see her standing in the window of an abandoned carriage, smiling at me.
Story number 8.
It started with the babysitting job. I was a college student, short on cash, and when the listing popped up for a one-night gig, I jumped at the chance. $500 for one evening, the ad read, experienced babysitter needed for overnight care. It sounded too good to be true, but I convinced myself it was worth it. I called the number, and a woman with a soft, almost trembling voice answered. Her name was Mrs. Holloway. She explained that her young son, Timmy, needed care while she and her husband attended a work event. When I arrived at their house that evening, I felt uneasy. The house was enormous, old, and isolated, surrounded by dense woods. The driveway alone was long enough to make me question how far civilization was. But the pay was good, so I shook it off and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Holloway opened the door and smiled, but there was something strange about her. Her eyes darted around nervously, and she kept glancing behind her as if expecting something or someone to appear. She introduced me to Timmy, a quiet boy with wide, curious eyes. He looked pale and tired, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. The rules are simple, Mrs. Holloway said, handing me a folded piece of paper. He needs to be in bed by 8:30. Don't let him stay up too late. She paused, her voice dropping, and whatever you do, don't open the basement door. Before I could ask why, she and her husband were gone, their car disappearing down the dark driveway. The evening started out fine. Timmy was quiet but polite. We played a few board games, and he ate his dinner without complaint. By 8:30, he was in bed, just as Mrs. Holloway had instructed. I settled onto the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like scratching, coming from the basement door. I froze, my heart pounding. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I stood up, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The basement door was at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I could see the staircase descending into darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just more scratching. I thought about Mrs. Holloway's warning, don't open the basement door, but it was already open. I stepped closer, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob to pull it shut. Don't. The voice came from behind me. I spun around to see Timmy standing there, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to his chest. His eyes were wide and his voice was barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to go down there." "I wasn't," I said, trying to sound calm. "I was just closing the door." Timmy shook his head. "It doesn't like the door closed." A chill ran down my spine. "What doesn't like it closed?" Timmy's gaze dropped to the floor. "The thing in the basement." I stared at him, unsure if he was playing a prank or if he genuinely believed what he was saying. "Timmy, there's nothing in the basement," I said, trying to reassure both him and myself. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Timmy's grip on his rabbit tightened. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered. The house seemed to groan, the walls creaking as if something heavy was pressing against them. I grabbed Timmy's hand, my instincts kicking in. "We're leaving," I said, pulling him toward the front door. But the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding us in. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the basement stairs. Timmy whimpered, burying his face in my side. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no answer. The door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And then, I saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out from the shadows, its long, clawed fingers gripping the edge of the door. The rest of it followed, a figure hunched and unnatural, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its eyes were empty sockets, black and endless, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. It didn't walk. It crawled, its movements jerky and inhuman, its claws scraping against the floor. Timmy screamed, and I did too, yanking him behind me as the thing crept closer. "We have to hide!" Timmy cried, tugging at my arm. He led me upstairs, the thing following, its breath ragged and wet. We barricaded ourselves in a bedroom, shoving furniture against the door. Timmy crawled under the bed, and I crouched beside him, trying to keep quiet. The house was silent again, but I could feel it out there, waiting. The doorknob rattled, and then came the scratching, slow and deliberate, on the other side of the door. "Why is it here?" I whispered, barely able to speak. Timmy's voice was shaking. "It comes for everyone. Mom and Dad said it's part of the house. It doesn't let people leave." Tears streamed down my face as the scratching turned to pounding. The door splintered, and I knew we wouldn't survive the night. I don't know how I escaped. I woke up hours later, lying in a ditch by the side of the road, my car parked nearby. The Holloways were gone, the house abandoned. I told the police, but they found no trace of the family, no signs of the creature. Just an empty, rotting house with a basement door that wouldn't stay shut. Sometimes in my dreams, I hear the scratching.
Story number 9.
I had always loved the thrill of exploring abandoned places. Old houses, factories, hospitals, they fascinated me. There was something poetic about forgotten spaces, a beauty in the decay. But after what happened last fall, I've never stepped into one again. It was supposed to be a quick exploration. I'd heard rumors about the Hollow Creek Sanatorium, an abandoned mental hospital deep in the woods. It had been shut down in the 1950s after allegations of abuse and neglect. According to local legends, patients were tortured there and some never left. The stories didn't scare me. I thought they were just that, stories. My best friend Sam came with me. He loved this kind of stuff too. We arrived at the sanatorium just before sunset, the air crisp and the forest eerily quiet. The building loomed before us, its windows shattered, ivy creeping up its crumbling walls. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property, but someone had cut a hole in it. We slipped through and made our way inside. The first thing that struck me was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. Rotting wood, mildew, and something else. Something metallic, like blood. The hallways were lined with peeling paint and broken furniture. Rusted wheelchairs and gurneys sat abandoned in the corners. We walked carefully, our flashlights casting long, shifting shadows. The place was silent, save for the occasional drip of water or creak of the floorboards. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Creepy, but cool," Sam said, snapping a picture of a rusted set of restraints bolted to a wall. We made our way to the second floor, where the patient rooms were. Most were empty, their doors hanging off their hinges. But one room caught my attention. The door was closed, and scratched into the wood were the words, "Help me," in jagged, uneven letters. "Let's check it out," Sam said, grinning. He pushed the door open with a creak. The room was small, with a rusted bed frame and a single window boarded up from the outside. A pile of yellowed papers sat in the corner. I picked one up and squinted at the faded handwriting. It was a patient's journal. The entries were short and fragmented, written in a trembling hand. "They keep coming at night. The whispers don't stop." I saw it in the corner again. It has no face. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. "They're in the walls. Don't trust the walls." I showed the journal to Sam and we both laughed nervously. "Someone's idea of a joke," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. As we moved deeper into the sanatorium, the air grew colder. It wasn't just the natural chill of an old building. It felt unnatural, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers started soon after. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a faint murmuring just on the edge of hearing. I turned to Sam. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I didn't answer. The whispers grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong, pleading and angry, a desperate, furious hissing. "Let's head back," I said, my voice shaking. "Yeah, good idea," Sam agreed. He sounded scared, too. We retraced our steps, but something was wrong. The hallways seemed longer, unfamiliar. Doors we had passed earlier were closed now, and others were open that hadn't been before. "That's weird," Sam muttered. I swear this was the way out. The whispers were louder now, overlapping, filling the air like a swarm of angry insects. The shadows seemed to shift and move, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. And then we saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was wrapped in a tattered straitjacket, its arms twisted unnaturally. But the worst part was its face. It had none. Just smooth, pale flesh where its features should have been. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, if you could call it watching. "Run," I whispered, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing took a step forward, like for say, and the lights in the hallway flickered. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of anger and despair. Sam grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We need to go. Now." We ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The thing didn't follow us, but the whispers did, growing louder and angrier with every step. Finally, we found the stairwell. As we raced down, I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck. I screamed, nearly tripping over the stairs, but when I turned, nothing was there. We burst out of the sanatorium and into the woods, gasping for air. The whispers stopped the moment we crossed the threshold, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest. We didn't speak as we ran back to the car. Neither of us wanted to admit what we had seen, what we had heard. I haven't spoken to Sam since that night. I don't know why. We just stopped calling each other, as if acknowledging it would make it real. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like they're calling me back, and when I look at the walls of my bedroom, I swear I see something moving just beneath the surface.
Story number 10.
I didn't believe the stories at first. Every small town has its legends, its creepy places that parents warn their kids about. For us, it was Widow's Hollow, a patch of dense forest just outside the edge of town. People whispered about it in hushed tones, stories of strange lights, missing pets, and even the occasional person who wandered in and never came out. I thought it was all nonsense, until I went there myself. It was my friend Derek's idea. He was always into creepy stuff, always daring me to do stupid things. "It's just a bunch of trees," he said, grinning as we stood at the edge of the hollow one Saturday night. What's the worst that could happen? The air felt different as soon as we stepped in. Colder, heavier. The towering trees seemed to lean in, their branches twisting unnaturally. It was quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird chirped, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. We walked deeper, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the thick darkness. "See?" Derek said, his voice too loud in the stillness. "Nothing to be scared of." But then we found the first marker. It was an old, rotting wooden sign nailed to a tree. The letters were faded, barely legible, but I could just make out the words, "Turn back now." "Creepy," Derek said, snapping a picture with his phone. But probably just some kids messing around. I didn't say anything. My stomach was in knots, and I had the distinct feeling we were being watched. We kept walking, though I kept glancing over my shoulder. That's when we started finding the ribbons, strips of red fabric tied to branches and trunks, leading us deeper into the woods. Derek said it was probably a trail marker, but they felt wrong. The fabric was weathered, almost greasy to the touch, and some of the strips had dark stains I didn't want to think about. "Maybe we should head back," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Seriously?" Derek rolled his eyes. "We've barely even started." That's when the laughter began. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but as we stood there, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched and shrill, like a child's giggle distorted through a broken speaker. "Hello?" Derek called out, his bravado slipping. The laughter stopped. Then, from somewhere ahead of us came a voice. "Why are you here?" It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" Derek shouted, shining his flashlight toward the source of the voice. But the light didn't reach far. It just seemed to vanish into the darkness. "Turn back," the voice said again, "before it sees you." "Before what sees us?" I didn't want to know. I grabbed Derek's arm. "Let's go, now." He hesitated, but something in my voice must have convinced him. We turned back, moving faster now, our flashlights bouncing erratically. The forest seemed different, the trees closer together, the path unfamiliar. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl, like an animal, but wrong. Too deep, too wet, as if it came from a throat full of water. "Run," Derek whispered, and we did. We sprinted through the woods, the growling growing louder, closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Something was following us. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, feel its heavy footsteps vibrating through the ground. Derek screamed, and I turned just in time to see him fall. His flashlight hit the ground, its beam flickering wildly. Something was there, looming over him. It was massive, its body twisted and shadowy, its face hidden except for two glowing yellow eyes. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. Derek screamed again, his voice cutting off abruptly as the thing reached for him with a long, clawed hand. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing at the edge of the woods. When I turned, the hollow was silent again, as if nothing had happened. The police didn't believe me when I told them what I saw. They searched the woods for days, but found no sign of Derek. The only thing they recovered was his flashlight, broken and covered in something they couldn't identify. I moved away from town after that, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. And when I dream, I see those yellow eyes, watching me from the shadows.